Okay. Well, welcome everybody. We're so glad again to be welcoming you to our Lunch and Learn series. Hard to believe we've been doing this for a couple years now. We've had so many great topics and so many great speakers. And this is going to be a great precursor into what will certainly be an amazing 50th anniversary celebration that we're starting to plan for 2024 and through the use of a conference. So certainly, we love being able to provide this level of engagement with you guys. It started just from the need to have some level of engagement during the COVID pandemic, and we've just never stopped. So hopefully we'll be able to continue doing that. But for today, kind of an odd situation. I'm happy to welcome all of you, but also myself as the speaker today. I will have Julie intro, but as a means of introducing the overall Lunch and Learn, I'm Josh Haas, as part of HMANA and vice chair for the board. I'm just thrilled to be able to volunteer for this great organization, and I see so much benefit to what HMANA provides, not only the US, but all of North America and beyond. So we're really happy to have you here. Today, we're going to focus on an overview from a Raptor ID perspective. And before we get too deep into that, I do want to just level set some expectations. Just as a reminder for Zoom, you are all muted and you don't have the capability to unmute yourself. So that is on purpose. Please pop open your chat window, which you can get at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and engage with us. Say good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're from, what count site you prefer to go to or is close to home for you, and also be willing to ask questions. This is really the sole way that we can take your questions is through the chat. So as you have them during the program, please feel free to post them. And the famous Julie Brown, as always, will be taking note of those questions and who's asking them, and she'll present those to me at the end of the talk. So the plan, as always, is to go through about 45 minutes of presentation and then allow 10 or 15 minutes or so for questions. So I think we're in good shape, Julie. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, and then I'll turn it back to you. Most of you know this guy, I think. If you have been to past Lunch and Learns, you've gotten to know Josh. He actually gave this talk a couple of years ago now, I think, but we love bringing it back. There's always time for Raptor ID, especially during the migration season. So it's a nice review for everybody. And so Josh is our HMANA board vice chair currently, and he's also the chair of our marketing committee, also our go-to person for a lot of our web support. So he does a lot at our organization. He has spent 7 fall seasons working for the Detroit River Hawkwatch as a relief counter. And there he really honed his skills and developed a love for teaching visitors unique ways of telling the shadowy specks apart. His goal of making hawks accessible to everybody spawned his new movie, Hawks on the Wing, and teaching viewers hawks in flight through the use of video and audio commentary, which you'll see in this presentation. Josh's passion started with raptors, but he can be found birding and photographing in all seasons, often with his beautiful family, which are his wife, daughter, and son. So with that, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Julie. Yeah, so I, as Julie mentioned from my introduction, I absolutely love the challenge of Raptor ID. And part of what spawned that love was my experience at the Detroit River Hawkwatch. And if you've never been to Detroit, they are known for big numbers of broadwings, red-tailed hawks, turkey vultures, to name a few. But they're also known with the frustration of having birds that are often very far out. But what's so unique about that is while it's frustrating for a lot of folks, especially photographers, it does offer a great opportunity to hone your identification skills. And, when I think about Raptor ID, I often like to tell people that it's kind of a collision of art and science in a way. And what I mean by that is there's certainly a scientific approach to identifying raptors and other birds, but there's also a feeling to identifying raptors, especially in flight when we're talking about their flight cadence, the shape as we see it, sometimes at a far distance, just how they're flapping their wings, and more importantly than even those two in some cases is their behavior. And so don't be afraid to use behavioral traits as part of the identification process. And what's really especially important in this identification process is forcing yourself to get away from field mark ID. And if you've ever been to a count site, especially in spring, when these birds are migrating from their wintering grounds to their breeding grounds, so from south to north, we're oftentimes looking directly into the sun. So what that means is we're seeing silhouettes. And so field mark ID, the type of identification that we apply to things like passerine birds, shorebirds, things like that, we have to throw that out the window. And we have to, embark on a different type of journey that includes, again, looking at the shape that we're seeing, the type of wing flap, whether it's stiff or loose or flexible, things like that. That's the type of identification that we're talking about. And what's important here is that one specific trait is not enough. And so I always like to tell people, and you're going to hear me say this a lot today, you have to get a few pieces of the puzzle, not just one, for the image to start to appear. And so one trait is not nearly enough. We have to have more than one. And a perfect example of this is in sharp-shinned hawks. So often we'll focus on the tail of Sharpies, or really accipiters in general. And when we do that, we're really focusing on one trait and one trait alone. And any experienced hawk watcher will tell you that there is a certain percentage of Sharpies that come through with round-looking tails. And in the same respect, Coopers can come through with square-looking tails. So that's just an example showcasing that one trait is never enough. We have to build a few upon each other to definitively or diagnostically identify these birds. It's also important that you're here. So we have great participation. I always get great participation in Raptor ID programs compared to some of my other talks that I provide, because I think that challenge is in a lot of us, and we want to know more. We crave at being able to identify these birds because it's part of the connection that we want to have with the natural world. And so by being able to identify them, it helps us better connect. But while you're here, I am sadly here to tell you that it's not the best way to learn. I'm going to make it as close to that as possible, but there's nothing like spending time outside live in front of birds moving with an expert at your side. So at a count site, any number of our hundreds of count sites that we support through HMANA, and the ability for you to join in this effort and get help from the experts that are in the field. That is the best way to go about learning ID. You have to immerse yourself in it live. But you know what? Today we're going to try and give you the next best thing, and I believe that's through the use of video. And we're going to use that medium a lot today. It's also important to have a realistic expectation as you go to the count site that not everything is going to be identifiable. And even if you go to hawkcount.org, our famed website that we love dearly at HMANA, and you look at the sheer amount of data out there for a specific count site, you're going to see unidentified accipiter, unidentified falcon, unidentified buteo. That's okay. That's showing you that even the experts can't do it all the time. Even the famous Jerry Ligori, that was always something he would share with people. Don't put so much pressure on yourself. Not everything can be identified, and that's okay. So kind of building upon that silhouette ID, you can see here, this is the same bird 4 times. On the extreme left might represent what we see in a city environment in the early morning or end of the day where the lighting's good, the birds are close, and we can see all this great field mark identification. But on the extreme right, you see it's a pure silhouette. And again, in spring, this is likely what you're going to see at a distance as you're facing south into the sun. So we have to get rid of that classic field mark identification technique and really employ a new set of tools by way of using shape, flight cadence, and plumage where we can get it to put those pieces of the puzzle together and get a definitive ID. So speaking of that puzzle, just like any puzzle we were to put together, it doesn't take putting all the pieces together in order to get an idea or to see that image start to appear. Just with seeing those patagials and the shape of that wing, any experienced hawk watcher can tell that this is a red-tailed coming into view. Now, granted, I know this goes against my rule of not using plumage and field mark ID, but hopefully you can get the overall point in that you don't need all pieces of the puzzle to have this definitive ID. You just need a few. But most importantly, don't rely on one and one alone. So in terms of general migrating families that we're going to talk through today, we're going to showcase as many birds as we can. That's going to ideally be probably 9 or 10 total with the time that we have. And so we're going to look at a couple accipiters, certainly Sharpies and Coops, because they are the two probably most talked about and difficult pairings that we have. So we're going to feature those two individually, as well as a side-by-side video right from my movie that'll tell you and walk you through how to identify them together on the screen at the same time. Accipiters are your forest-dwelling raptors with long tails, more short, broad wings that allow for a lot of maneuverability. So they're the birds that are going to be coming snatching birds off your feeders that you may be wondering, who was that flashed through? And don't be afraid to enjoy that. You have to think of the circle of life and the fact that these birds have to eat too, so don't be afraid of that. Next, we have our falcons. We can see the peregrine. We've already talked a little bit about a peregrine, but you also have the merlin and the kestrel, and we're going to feature those two today. These are our speed demons. The wings are typically more slender and oftentimes swept back to a point to really provide them that adaptation of speed. Next, our bootios. Many of our sites, including our volunteers, coordinators, and counters, have already gone through the spectacle of broad-winged hawk migration, where we're seeing massive groups of birds come through at once. In fact, we just featured a tour to Veracruz where most, if not all, of the broadwings are finding their way down that Mexican peninsula, on their way through Panama and down into South America. And so Veracruz is known for that site getting millions of broadwings coming through. And so if we move to the northern region, especially like where I am in the Great Lakes region, we're lucky enough at Detroit to have maybe 50,000 come through, and that's a huge spectacle for us. But that is a perfect example of a buteo with large, broad wings that allow them great, easy lift for very efficient flight with a lack of flapping, if you will. So we'll feature a couple buteos, especially one that's a later season migrant, the rough-legged hawk. Because it's mid-October, I tried to choose species that count sites are going to still continue to see or have yet to see, so that you can apply this just in time and go out to your closest field site to apply what you're learning. Next, we have our eagles. We're going to feature the bald and golden eagle today, as well as another side-by-side, so we can see these guys next to each other and walk through some quick tips on how to differentiate the two. Bald eagles, can wreak some havoc on the coastline sites, especially on the East Coast and then along the Great Lakes, because them, along with osprey, tend to be local as well. So we have to kind of employ a different set of rules to determine whether they're migrating or whether they're local. So that might not be a problem at some of our ridge sites or west of the Mississippi type flight line sites will have, but certainly something to consider where the behavior comes into play as well. Lastly, we have our specialty birds like the ospreys and harriers. And today we're going to feature the harriers because there's certainly still time for a lot of our sites to have harriers trickling through. So we'll start off with our accipiters and our sharp-shinned hawk, or as a lot of us call them, Sharpies. Just a level set, the rest of today, you're going to see this makeup of a chart over and over. You can see the range map on the extreme left side. The quick flight tips. So these aren't going to be as field mark centric. Remember, they're going to be flight ID tips. A picture of the bird, which, take this with a grain of salt, okay? This is actually a Sharpie that's in active flight, so the shape and behavior of the bird is really important, whether it's soaring or gliding or in active flight. And speaking of that, you can see the two profiles, whether it be soaring or gliding. And it's really cool. In a lot of these birds, you're going to see a different profile based on whether they're soaring or gliding. So pay attention to that when you're in the field. First, figure out, what is this bird doing? Is it soaring? Okay, what is soaring? Let's level set. Soaring is the bird lazily going in circles, maybe a little bit of flapping here or there, depending on what type of bird it is. But they're going in circles and they're rising in altitude. Okay, and so that's soaring. In contrast, gliding would be part of their active flight, to mean, just like we see in this Sharpie here, they're flapping in a straight, they're moving in a straight line from point A to point B. So they're either flapping and gliding or just simply flapping, depending on the species and what they're doing at the time. That would be active flight, where we're going to see a glide profile. And in some cases, like we see here with the Sharpie, it's going to be different. So that sets up what you're going to see in a lot of these charts. And in terms of the Sharpie, this is a very tiny, compact accipiter, very small bird with a very quick, rapid, and very snappy wing beat that's more from the wrist. So when I say that, if you picture, like, look at me flapping with just my hands as opposed to my whole arm. If I had wings, my arms would be the wings, and my wrists here that you see would be the wrists of those wings, from about halfway out the wing to the tip. Their heads also appear very, very compact and small, especially relative to their cousin, the coop. They don't showcase much head projection, meaning they don't push their head far forward in front of their wings. And that, on top of that, especially in active flight, they push their wrists forward in active flight. So it creates this nice little pocket for the head to sit nicely within. We'll see that on the video in another photo soon. And we'll showcase that in the ID tips. So they throw those wrists or those shoulders forward, and it creates that little pocket for the tiny head to sit within. Also, in the initial part of this clip I'm about to show, look at what I call a pinch point of a fanned tail that comes to a really tiny pinched point where it meets the body. It's not as substantial where it meets the body, and that's kind of classic for a Sharpie. So let's take a look at what this looks like in video. So here's a soaring bird. Remember, we're looking for a flat wing, no upturn, no dihedral. Notice how flat it is. Also look for that pinch point that I was talking about. Right there, you can see there's very little tail there where it meets the body. It's that pinch point I'm talking about. Notice the wings were very perpendicular, okay? There's no, in a soar, there's no pocket, there's no wrist thrown forward. Now we're seeing a little bit more flapping while it's soaring. These birds are very light, they're not as stable, so they're gonna flap more both when they're soaring and in their active flight. Again, notice that totally flat wing profile in a soar. Now we do see that square tail. That is kind of the common ID tip that everybody starts with. Look for a square tail on a Sharpie, and we do see that in this bird. So that is one piece of the puzzle. Notice now this bird's created that pocket. We see that little pocket, that little area where that tiny head is sitting nicely within. And I always say Sharpies look like little button mushrooms when they're gliding overhead. And part of that is that wing shape where that pocket's created. They look like that kind of roundish, curved shape overhead, just like a button mushroom. So in contrast, let's look at our Cooper's hawk, the cousin. So yes, we're looking for that round tail, but remember that's only one piece of the puzzle. In a soar, they're also going to hold their wings very perpendicular to their bodies, but look at the difference in the soar profile. So when they're soaring, they tend to hold their wings more in this upturned dihedral, as we call it. And so that's kind of about the same as, like, say, a red-tailed in a soar, and totally different than a Sharpie. So if you have a small looking soaring accipiter and it's showcasing a slight dihedral, there's a perfect piece of the puzzle that should get you down the direction and looking at Cooper's hawk. Also notice the head projection. Again, how far forward that head is projecting in front of the leading edge of the wings. That's hugely important with Cooper's hawks, because unless there's really high winds, they're going to project their larger heads forward both in a soar and an active flight, which is not what the Sharpie typically does. And what I've noticed is in higher winds is really the only time when a Cooper's hawk will really thrust their wrists forward and kind of create that same pocket for the head to sit within. But the difference is their head goes beyond that pocket and it's always projecting forward, whether it's a smaller male or the larger female. Now their wing beat, in contrast to the Sharpie, is much stiffer and it's using the whole wing. So in my example, that's me using all of my arms, not just the wrist. So let's look and try to notice that in the video. So here's a soaring bird. It's going to show some wing flapping as well. As it turns around, look for that very subtle dihedral, that upturned wing as he turns through. It's very subtle, but it's upturned. And hopefully you also notice the perpendicular wings and the head projection, especially as we're seeing right there. We can see how much farther forward that head is projecting. In addition, remember that pinch point we talked about with the sharp-shinned hawk? We're not seeing that in the Cooper's hawk. There's a more substantial tail that meets the body. Also notice how much more stable this bird is. It's certainly flapping, but not nearly as often as the sharp-shinned hawk. It's much heavier relative to the Sharpie, and they're just a more stable bird as they're soaring. In active flight, look for that stiff wing beat. We're still going to see mostly perpendicular wings compared to the body, as we see right there. Look for that head projection. The wing beat is slightly slower than that super rapid wing beat of the Sharpie, so always look for that. That can be a little bit subjective and certainly comes with practice, so that's something that you really have to work at and experience to get better and better at that. Here we're just going to see two images of the two side by side, the Coop on the left, the Sharpie on the right. And we can kind of start to see that nice pocket on the right where that head is just looking a lot smaller than what it would be with a Coop flying through. So with that in mind, let's look at a side-by-side video straight from Hawks on the Wing and look for a lot of these traits and see if you can point them out yourself.
The sharp-shinned versus Cooper's comparison represents one of the most difficult pairings, but there are clues that help distinguish the two. Notice the Cooper's hawk on the right has a longer, bulkier tail that also feels more round. Don't forget, however, the round versus square tail doesn't always hold true. Also notice the Sharpie on the left shows a smaller head that is tucked back closer to the body, where the Coop's head projects forward. While soaring, Sharpies will flap more often because they are less stable, where the Coop holds steady. Also look as the sharp-shinned hawk is making tighter circles. The bird is actually starting to get ahead of the Coop. Comparing the wing flap is easier when side by side. Notice the Cooper's hawk has a slightly slower wing beat, but more importantly it's using more of the entire wing, whereas the Sharpie is quicker, snappier, and flaps more from the wrist outward. Check out this Sharpie displaying its tendency to flap more often, where the Coop is gliding longer between flaps.
Okay, let's dive into our falcons. So remember, these guys are all about speed, so the shape of the wing is going to be different. And hopefully you can see that very quickly as we look at our American kestrel, which I always like to say they're basically a body with banana peels for wings. So very slender, long wings compared to their bodies. Now look at the soaring and glide profiles, similar to that of a Sharpie, very flat in a soar and slightly downturned in a glide. They're very small, incredibly nimble, and they're also very buoyant. And so you're going to see these birds, occupying a lot of airspace. And what I mean by that is they're moving left and right a lot. They're moving up and down in altitude a lot. And they have a very light, fluttery wing beat that again showcases their banana peel-like wings. They're very dainty overall compared to the Merlin as well, which is a heavier set falcon. And so look for that daintiness and those long, very slender wings. The first thing I always look at in a small falcon is the wing shape, because the daintiness is never seen in a Merlin. Merlins are so much stockier, and the wing really showcases that. So it's the first place that I go when I see a falcon. So let's take a look at this bird in flight. All right, so here's our soaring bird. Again, we're looking for that flat winged profile, and they're the perfect quintessential thin banana peel wings of the American kestrel. Look at it's a very buoyant type of flight. They're thrown off course a lot because of, again, how light they are, and they're going up and down, left and right. They in some cases just don't look like they have a whole lot of purpose to their migration flight. In contrast, the merlin goes and goes and goes and never stops. So this bird's buffeted by the winds a lot. It's going to be very buoyant and very animated in flight. It glides again, soars again with those wings very flat. And now that we start to see the active flight and more of that gliding, we're going to see the slightly downturned wing. It's a very fluttery, pretty rapid wing beat. And again, there's that downturn in the wing and a glide. But you can still see, even as similar as that is to a Sharpie, much thinner wings and daintier look overall. So in contrast, we have our merlin. Again, just looking quickly at that wing, it's a much more substantial, stockier looking wing, especially in the secondaries and where the wing meets the body. So from leading edge, that front edge, to trailing edge, the back edge of the wing, that's where I'm looking for that bulk. And so they're stocky. One of the best things I learned from one of my mentors early on is merlins look like kestrels on steroids, almost like a kestrel went to the gym and was bodybuilding. So a much stockier bird overall, both in the wing and the body. So they also tend to be very feisty and fearless. So remember at the beginning when I told you that behavior is also an important identification tip. This holds so true with merlins. They occupy their space and they don't want anything or anyone in it. So regardless of whether it's a kestrel or another merlin or even a bird as sizable as a golden eagle, they're going to go after them. You're going to hear it and you're going to see it. They want their space. And furthermore, these birds are leaving from point A. They have a goal to get to point B. They take a straight line and they don't diverge from that unless they're going after something. And that going after something could be, a golden eagle that they're, mad at or, want to get out of their way. Or it could also be a bird or butterfly or dragonfly on the wing. These birds are known for hunting on the wing, especially during migration. They never stop and they eat on the wing and keep going. And all the while, they're going from point A to point B. Jerry Ligori, Pete Dunn, all the greats will describe in their books that the wing flap and cadence of a merlin is like a piston engine. And if you're familiar with the way a piston works in an engine, it's going up and down relentlessly, rhythmically, over again. And that is the perfect way to describe a merlin's wing flap. And again, they go from point A to point B with a very direct purpose, which is in total contrast to what we typically see in American kestrels.
I found this on the web.
I have to shut Siri up there. Sorry. All right, so here's our merlin in active flight. You're rarely going to see merlins soar. And look at that stocky wing. Not only is it a stocky body, but the wing, so much more importantly, is stocky compared to the kestrel. And that's what we're looking for first and foremost. I bet all the hawk watchers on the line are going to say the same thing. Also notice that the wing on the trailing edge is very flat and perpendicular to the body, but we still get that leading edge with a very swept back point on, again, that leading edge of the wing. Classic merlin in active flight. Here's another active flight view of the merlin. He's going from point A to point B, flapping most of the way, very rhythmically, and again, like that piston engine, going up and down very, very rhythmically, repetitively, over and over and over. To put it in perspective, when I took a lot of the footage of merlins at Cape May years ago, I left. I mean, we had a day while I was there with, I think they call it the trifecta, where we had over 100 individuals of all three falcon species in a day. And so it's a great place to see falcons in fall. It's a magical place overall. But out of all those numbers, all the video footage that I took, I only had 3 video clips of soaring merlins, of all those merlins that I filmed. So it really showcases just how active they are in their flight. The last thing I'll say about merlin before we move into our bootios as well is that Merlins like the low altitude. They like to hug the tree line, and oftentimes they'll pop above the tree line over the deck or your count site at the last minute. And oftentimes Merlins are the ones that someone says they saw in past tense because they sneak up on you, they rush through very quickly, and you had hardly any time to figure out your ID. That in and of itself is a behavioral trait that helps with identification. Certainly not the only piece of the puzzle, but it is definitely one of them. So moving into our Bootios, we're going to start with the bird that we're going to benchmark or use as a benchmark and compare the rest to. All the books tell you to do it this way, and it's for a reason. It works. So we always like to say that red-tailed hawks are very muscular, large muscular birds. They're very stocky, muscular birds. And we say muscular, what I'm referring to is the trailing edge of the wing, especially in these secondaries where it meets the primary flight feathers. And Bob Pettit always used to say, many of you know Bob, he always used to say in talks, if you picture a bodybuilder holding up and showcasing their bicep, if you go ahead and turn that upside down, now that bicep is curving underneath your arm. That's what we're talking about when we describe the muscular nature of that wing on the red-tailed. So that's something to kind of look for. The other thing, and you'll see this in the video clip, oftentimes that wing is so muscular. When they have a fully fanned tail, it looks like the tail is meeting the wing, not the body. And that's a telltale sign of a red-tailed hawk. Their wing beat, relative to their size, they're a pretty bulky bird. Relative to their size is quite fast. It's snappy as well. And much like I mentioned earlier, they hold their wing in a slight upturned dihedral when they're soaring and mostly flat when they're gliding. All right, so we'll kick things off with a soaring bird. Notice the fanned tail and that very muscular wing shape. And in some facets of soaring, you can actually see the tail as it looks like it's going into the wing, not the body. Here's that muscular wing that we're talking about as those secondary feathers are really hanging back in the trailing edge of the wing. And now we can start to look for that slight upturned dihedral as it's soaring. Classic red tail, very, very stable. Notice in this soaring clip, it's rarely flapping its wings. It's not buffeted by winds very much. Similar to, a large, lanky bald eagle. They're just very stable when they're soaring. In contrast, a red-shouldered hawk, any little bit of wind, they're so light, they get buffeted. They have to flap and kind of readjust and get back on course. The red-tailed hawk oftentimes just adjusts or stretches its shoulders and gets right back on course. In active flight, look at that wing beat. It shows power and rhythm, but it's also pretty shallow overall, meaning it doesn't go way above the body or way below the body. So here's one of my ever favorite raptors, the rough-legged hawk. I mean, this bird is amazing. Look at this range map. This range map tells it all. Look how far north this bird is. This is where hawkcount.org is your best friend, because if you're planning a trip to a hawk watch and you specifically want to see rough-legged hawks, do not go in September. You're not going to see these birds. You have to go in late October into November, especially if you're in the latitude where I am in the Midwest in southern Michigan. I'm not looking for rough-leggeds until November. And so have that in mind as well. If it's late September and you see a Buteo that has maybe less muscular looking wings, it's very broad wing-like, but it looks like maybe those wings are really stretched out. You might want to think rough-legged hawk, but don't put Swainson's hawk off your radar either. They look like stretched out broad wings, and they're going to come through in September, at least in my latitude. And so don't think rough-legged in middle of September. You can throw that out. I mean, certainly weirder things have happened, but that's not by the norm something that we're going to consider in September in the Great Lakes. So they're thin-winged, but they're more more rectangular, not nearly as muscular or broad as, say, something like a red-tailed hawk or a broad-winged hawk. So very rectangular. They're at home in the air. If you've ever experienced whitefish point migration, which is another magical site, these guys, at Whitefish Point, these birds have to decide whether or not they're going to go across an 18-mile journey over water or not. And a lot of the birds, especially the juveniles, will hit that, they'll try, and within a half mile, they're coming right back. And it's only under the best conditions that they'll go for it. Where a good, healthy adult rough-legged, regardless, they're going for it. They're just so at home in the air, and they show confidence in their flight. They have an extremely upturned dihedral in their soar. And here's a new one for today. They hold a modified dihedral when they're in active flight, meaning it's a dihedral in that the wings go away from the body up, but then they flatten out from wrist to tip. So we'll look for that in the video. So we'll start with a soaring bird. Notice the longer, thinner structure of the wing relative to what we just saw on that muscular red-tailed hawk. They also tend to thrust their wings forward a little bit. It almost starts to take on the look of a shallow C in the alphabet. Longer wings, a little bit more rectangular looking. They're not nearly as shapely as something like a red-tailed hawk. Longer tail, at home in the air. Look how confident this bird is, just lazily soaring, moving around. Only has to stretch its shoulders or just a flap here and there to keep on course. Now we're going to start to see some active flight. The bird has a very deep, rhythmic wing beat that's much slower than a red-tailed hawk. And now we get to see that perfect modified dihedral where the wing is leaving the body up, and then from wrist to tip, it's flattening out. Perfect view of that modified dihedral. Very similar to a harrier or a turkey vulture in that case. Very at home in the air, easy flyer. This bird was at Whitefish Point, guaranteed. And certainly went on its way, even though it was showing juvenile plumage. We'll move into our eagles to kind of close out with the eagles and the harrier today. We're going to start with bald eagle because if you're like most sites, you're going to see more bald eagles than golden eagles. That might not always be true if we start to head further west into the more higher elevated sites. But for most of the U.S., bald eagles are going to be more the common bird. So much like we do with bootios and the red-tailed hawk, we're going to really concentrate and focus on the bald eagle to really kind of get that set in our brains. No different than when we're studying a new passerine or trying to add to our toolkit with field mark birding. We might start with something easy like a blue jay and really work on it for a period of time to the point where it becomes so easy it's second nature. That's what we want to try to do with things like red-tails and bald eagles, so that when we get a broad-winged or a rough-legged, or in this case a golden eagle, we know instinctively that something's different and we need to take a closer look. So with a bald eagle, it's a very plank-like rectangular wing structure. And I always like to say it looks like a 2x8 plank of wood with a head and tail. And speaking of head, they project their heads very far forward. And just because of the structure of their head as well as their bill for how they've adapted to eat, it looks massive in flight. This photo is not the photo that you want to look at for the head projection, but we're going to see it in the video very, very shortly. And look for very large head projected way forward to the point where in some cases it looks like it's as long as the bird's tail. They're flat-winged most of the time, but in active flight and when they're gliding, they take on a slightly bowed shape, almost the same as an osprey, but not nearly as pronounced. So at an extreme distance, they can look somewhat osprey-like. But as they get closer and you notice that bow shape is much less pronounced, you can throw osprey out the window, and now you can start to consider a bald eagle. So let's take a look at their slow, powerful wing beat and their rectangular wing shape in the video. So as always, we like to start with a soaring bird. Look at that plank-like rectangular wing. Again, 2x8 plank of wood with a head and tail. That head's projected way far forward. We can't see it at this distance, but part of what we're seeing in that head projection is their giant bill. Perfect rectangle, 2x8 plank of wood with a head and tail. Huge head projection. It almost looks the same length as the tail. So we want to kind of compare that head length to the length of the tail. Flat-winged, perfectly flat as it's soaring. Almost always perfectly flat with the bald eagle. Now in active flight, notice a slow, powerful wing beat. It's actually giving us a high wing beat above the body. We call that a deep upstroke. As it ends its flapping pattern and goes into a glide, it settles on a downstroke. So especially being a flat-winged bird, it's going to end on a downstroke. Here's another active bird. Now gliding in active flight, we start to see that shallow bow-shaped wing, kind of like an osprey, but much, much less pronounced. Just an ever so slight bow to their wing. So in contrast, we have the golden eagle, which that same mentor I mentioned earlier always liked to describe goldens as being more bootiol-like than actually being eagle-like. So they take on that more broad, shapely wing of, say, a bootiol instead of an eagle. They tend to look a lot longer-tailed, especially because their head projection's not there, and their heads look a lot smaller than a golden eagle, even though their overall size is similar. So their wing shape, again, is more bootiol-like. They take on a slight dihedral, upturned wing, much like a red-tailed hawk or a Cooper's hawk when they're soaring. And they have a shallow modified dihedral when they're in their glide. So let's take a look at their powerful but more flexible wing beat in the video. Have flexible in mind, or loose, when you look at this wing beat, because what I may have failed to mention in the bald eagle is it's a very stiff wing beat with a bald eagle. So let's look for that flexibility in this video. Here we go with a soaring bird, a little bit more shapely wing, more bootiol-like. The wing flap is more flexible, it's more loose, it just feels more floppy. It's not as stiff as that of the bald eagle. There's that shallow dihedral that we were talking about, just that shallow upturned wing in a soar. And these birds are also pretty darn stable in a soar. They're going to be at home in the sky and do very well in a soar. There's that slight dihedral, longish looking tail with a more shapely wing. Can't even see the head in that view. It really supports that book, Hawks at Every Angle. That's a really good one. A little bit floppier, looser, more flexible wing beat. We're going to see that even more so now. Not as stiff. Now, in contrast, this bird's going to be flapping, and when it stops flapping, it's going to end on an upstroke and settle into its dihedral-shaped glide, or modified dihedral glide in active flight. They always end on an upstroke. And most of the dihedral birds, the birds that have an upturned wing, will stop on an upstroke. So here's a good view of the head projection that we're talking about. The head projection on a bald eagle is going to go farther than that of a golden eagle. Overall, really what that means is just the head looks bigger, especially as we compare it to the length of the tail. So let's take a look at these guys side by side and try to pull out some of those tips that we just talked through.
Bald and golden eagles are both large and prominent in the sky, but some key differences are easy to pick out once you know what to look for. Even though the bald eagle on the left is closer, it shows thick, rectangular planked wings. It looks like a 2x8 plank of wood with a head and a tail. Speaking of heads, make sure to key in on the size of the head compared to the length of the tail. The bald eagle's head can appear as long as its tail, where the golden's head appears to be half the length of its tail or smaller. The golden on the right appears more bootiol-like with more muscular wings. Notice too, the bald eagle is soaring with flat wings. In comparison, the golden eagle has a slight upturned dihedral. The wing beat of the bald eagle is slow and stiff, but look at that deep upstroke. Golden eagles have slow wing beats as well, but they're uniformly shallow. Check out how the bald eagle ends on a downstroke when flapping. In comparison, the golden eagle ends on an upstroke before settling into its glide.
All right. So we're going to finish today with our northern harrier, which is, one of the more specialty type birds, considering the rest of what we've gone through. So this is another bird that has a very rectangular plank-like wing shape, but it's very long-winged, and at a distance they tend to take on, both behaviorally and the way they look, a more of a turkey vulture-like view. So at a distance they can kind of trick you into thinking maybe it's just a turkey vulture. But as always, we have to pay close attention to every bird that we're seeing. So very long-winged, very rectangular, where I always like to say that the bald eagle looks like a 2x8 plank of wood with a head and tail. With the harrier, I always like to say they look like a 2x4 plank of wood with a head and tail. So it's a thinner structure of that wing. It just appears longer. They have a very slow, steady wing beat, and they're very buoyant. They also can look tippy and teeter, similar to a turkey vulture. Again, behaviorally giving that turkey vulture look. One of the best tips that I ever heard for the type of wing beat of a harrier was from Cape May. And it looks like the bird is bouncing basketballs on the wing, and that's Eric Brunke's tip. I just always really liked that one, and we'll see that it just looks like a kid bouncing a basketball. It's just very smooth. It's slow and steady. So let's take a look at that in flight. So there's that rectangular wing, very long-tailed. You can't just look at that bright white rump, because we're going to see that in other birds as well, especially in high winds as the undertail coverts fold up and around. Look at the flight characteristics instead, and we see that dihedral. Look at the teetering nature of the bird, and there's that 2x4 plank of wood with a head and tail. In this instance, that tail is very long, almost accipiter-like. So long, thin wings with a long tail, go to harrier. If I didn't mention it during the picture, the last slide, we're going to start to see that modified dihedral in the bird. Okay, similar to golden eagle, turkey vulture, things like that. There it is. The wing goes up away from the body and then flattens out from wrist to tip. And right now we should start to see that bouncing basketballs as the bird starts to flap in active flight. It's quite slow relative to the other raptors that are coming through, and it's just very smooth. It's just steady, smooth, looks like it's bouncing basketballs on the wing. Beautiful bird, very buoyant. Even in active flight and glides, you can see it teetering. It's very buoyant in flight. As we can see there, you can also see slightly swept back wings, almost taking on a look of a falcon. And this is something Swainson's hawks do as well. They can start to look falcon-like in their active flight. So to end today, before we get to the question and answer time, which we're pretty good on time, let's throw it out there for those of you that are interested. These are all the side-by-sides that are offered on the Hawks on the Wing movie. And so if anyone wants to throw in the chat a side-by-side you'd like to see, Julie, I can't see the chat, so if you could just voice those to me, I'll get them playing.
Sure.
So go ahead, guys. Let's throw out a couple in the chat, and we'll see if we can get them playing for you.
We have nothing but experts here. Oh, okay. A couple suggestions for Swainson's hawk and goshawk versus Cooper's hawk.
Okay, we can do the Goss and Coop, but I don't have Swainson's included on this video. It's all Eastern birds. So it was Cooper's and Goss, right?
Yep.
Okay, so we'll go there.
Even though goshawks are larger than Cooper's hawks, size is often hard to judge with lone birds. Check out the goshawk on the left. The bird has a thicker, square-looking tail and slightly stockier-looking wings, giving hints of striving to be a boodio. The Cooper's hawk on the right is long-tailed with thinner-looking wings compared to the goshawk. When soaring, these birds hold their wings in a slightly different manner. The goshawk holds its wings flat, where the coop is showing a slight upturn or dihedral. Just as sharpies make tighter circles than coops when soaring, coops make tighter circles than goshawks. Notice how in control the goshawk is on the left. Its wing beat is also very smooth and powerful. In contrast, the Cooper's hawk is flapping more and seems less stable as it rises and drops in the air. Look at the goshawk's large head and extreme bulging on the trailing edges of its wings. The coop is stocky, but nowhere near as muscular.
I always like to point out, too, with goshawks, their heads appear much smaller when they're in a soar. So in active flight, where we saw that large snapping turtle-like head projection, you're not going to see that in a soar, and they actually look tiny relative to their bodies in a soar. Were there any others put in the chat, Julie?
Yes, there were. How about broadwing versus redtail?
There is a noticeable size difference between these two birds. Nevertheless, correctly identifying them can still be tricky. Check out how muscular and bulging the red-tailed hawk is on the left. The bird is a stocky, solid bootial that is at home in the sky. In comparison, notice the trailing edge of the wings on the broadwing hawk extends straight out from the body before tapering to a swept-back point. Broadwings also look clean and proper, where red-taileds only look fresh occasionally. The red-tailed has a slight upturned dihedral, where the broadwing shows a flat-winged appearance. Both hawks are stable in flight, however the broadwing will buck in winds where the red-tailed handles it. The wing beat of the red-tailed hawk on the left is shallow but rhythmic. In comparison, the broadwing on the right is snappier and sometimes feels more like an accipiter. Also notice the red-tailed hawk flaps more where the broadwing avoids flapping and glides longer.
How about one more,
Okay.
Julie, before we go into questions?
Okay, sure. Caroline, I wish we had your problem. She says in Alberta they have a problem distinguishing peregrines from gyrfalcons. I wish we had that problem
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
How about for a last one? There's many that people suggested, but how about red tail versus red shoulder?
Oh, that's a great one. Okay. Yeah, we'll do that. And depending on questions, if there's a little time, we can do a few more.
Okay.
In active flight, notice the red-tailed hawk on the left has a slightly slower wing beat. It is also more bulky and muscular looking than the red-shouldered hawk. The red-shouldered hawk will also rise and fall in altitude as it's less stable due to its lighter weight. While there is a size difference between these two hawks, this is hard to realize when they're alone in the sky. In a soar, look how much farther forward the red-shouldered on the right is pushing its wings ahead. The red-tailed also shows very muscular trailing edges to its wings. The red-tailed hawk also holds its wings in a slightly upturned dihedral when soaring, where the red-shouldered holds its wings mostly flat. In all facets of flight, the red-tailed hawk will appear more stable than a red-shouldered, and when brought off course, they only need a single flap or two to regain control.
Okay, Julie, how are we on questions? Did we get some today?
We did get some. We could answer a couple questions, and then if there's any time, we could do a couple more comparisons. Does that sound good?
Sure. Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay. All right. So just a few questions. Dana was wondering if she already has your DVD and your reference guide. She really liked your slides and was wondering if you ever have any of your PDFs available of your species slides, which have the map and the flight tips and the profiles.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't in PDF form at this point, but if you go to hawksonthewing.com and to my blog, the first thing that's out there right now is a recording of a talk much like this with even more species where you can see those slides as well as the video. So that's actually a good call out really for everybody if you want to see this again or more. You can certainly go there. We'll also feature a recording of this on the HMANA site. You know, we can get that up. And there's likely already a version of this out there if you go kind of last year, a couple years ago on our news site. So interesting. You know, one of the things some of you know, I'm a big photographer, still photographer as well. And one of the things that I'm really toying with doing is maybe a spiral bound guide on photographing birds in flight, namely raptors. And so I'm kind of thinking about things like that and e-guides, things like that that maybe we could offer. So I think it's a really cool suggestion. That might be something that we could offer for free right on the blog in that PDF form like you suggested. So thank you.
Another question, is there a decision tree one goes through as the bird is in the distance, meaning from distance, what sort of ID process do you go through?
What an excellent question. I work in software development, so decision tree, man, I'm digging it. So for me personally, it's certainly subjective. I think there are others on the line that might do this slightly differently, and Julie, as a hawk counter, could probably provide some insight too. But what I do is I look at the shape of the bird first. And so I'm looking for, and of course, depends on what angle it's at. So if it's head on, there's not much to go on. All we're looking at is, say, an active bird coming right at us. It's literally the wing profile, and that's it. So it's kind of a waiting game at that point. If it's more perpendicular or it's soaring and we're getting more information, I'm looking at that first. And then when it flaps its wings, I'm looking at that next. And then as it gets closer, if we're lucky enough for it to get closer in that time frame, if I'm lucky to have the time, then I'm also adding in behavior to it as well. So behavior to me, not only like the Merlin hunting and doing things like that, but also is the bird.
He was going down there.
Oh, somehow we have a hot mic. How is that possible? Oh, I'm sorry. That's on another. Sorry, I have another program going. So what I was getting at is behavior to mean it might be rising and lowering in altitude like a kestrel does, where a Merlin won't do that. So we'll bring in that behavioral trait as well.
Okay, great. I think those were the main questions. Temaima, sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, mentioned that is always tricked by pigeons. A couple other people said yes, they can look very falcon-like.
Yeah.
I will admit that I have been fooled by pigeons as well.
I love that was brought up, and kind of a bad sales pitch, but on Hawks on the Wing, if you own it and don't realize it, or if you're thinking about it, there's actually a video dedicated to birds that look like raptors. And pigeon is probably the first one. It's definitely included. I mean, they're very falcon-like with those, pointed, slender wings. But it's all about the wing flap. They have an incredibly, one of the most deep wing flaps I've ever seen on a bird from top to bottom. I mean, it is incredible. It's almost like the wings touch each other when they go up. It's so deep. And, it's often a waiting game. They tend to get closer and you will realize, but they also a lot of times aren't in flight that often. They'll fly and then they'll end their flight quicker than, say, a migrant raptor will. Not that happens every time, but it's certainly something to look for.
Josh, we're viewing your chat screen now rather than a slide. Just
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And I think that was the end of the questions. There were lots of suggestions for comparisons. I think one of them brought up osprey, which we didn't touch on. You didn't touch on too much.
Yeah.
Do you have any osprey comparisons?
Yeah, we could do bald eagle and osprey or rough-legged and osprey, which sounds weird at first, but because the rough-legged's so long-winged and a light morph is such light coloration when they're close enough, it tends to be a good one. You want to do that one?
Sure.
Osprey and rough-legged hawks seem different enough that they wouldn't trick you, but they can be deceivingly alike, especially with their plumages at a distance. This is where Flight ID clears up the picture. Notice the long, angular wings of the osprey on the left. They are always swept back, where the rough-legged hawk shows the classic buteo wings and pushes its wings slightly forward when soaring. The osprey also flies with flat or slightly bowed wings, where the rough-legged soars with an upturned dihedral. Both birds soar well, but the osprey holds more stable. The wing beat of the osprey is slow but stiff. It almost looks like the bird is in pain. The osprey's glide profile is curved and drooped, where the rough-legged's glide profile is raised and modified. Rough-leggeds also make flapping look easy, with slow but powerful wing beats that seem relaxed and natural.
So it is 1 o'clock. What would you like to do, Julie?
I think that's a good place to wrap things up, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, it is. And we have a lot to offer on the Humana site. I think what we'll do, we'll maybe Julie, you and I can talk through how we want to present this in the latest news post. We might even consider showing a more full length Raptor ID recording, which we have several of, just so people can take away more species. But we'll figure that out. So, Julie, I'll hand it back over to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Josh. Just as usual, really stunning photos and video and some great tips. As you said at the beginning, IDing raptors is kind of an art and a science, and just it's often, as you said, like a feeling. And I think that you do a really beautiful job at taking that feeling and kind of putting it to words. So lots of great feedback. I think people really appreciated your presentation. And if you're looking for more, I posted earlier in the chat, you can scroll up. Josh is giving another Hawk ID tonight for what, Michigan State, Josh? Or Michigan University?
It is through the U of M, but it's for the Washtenaw Audubon Society, which is in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you're welcome. Go Wolverines. Yeah, so you
It's
you
totally
can
on
feel,
Zoom, totally virtual, so
okay.
anyone can
You
join.
don't have to drive there.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you so much for that. If it just in closing, if you like today's program, you can, sign up for our e-newsletter, which you can do on our website. And you can always make a donation to Humana. We'd always appreciate your support, or become a member. And on kind of the same Hawk ID theme for November, I think mid-November, we'll have registration up soon. But our next Lunch and Learn is going to be covering our Raptor ID Facebook group. I don't know, maybe some of you are part of this group. It's really popular. There's over 19,000 members on Facebook. So if you are on Facebook, check it out. Brian Rusnica, he is one of the administrators for this group, along with 4 other administrators. So next month is going to be kind of a discussion. So this Facebook page is a great place to discuss like raptor species and subspecies and behavior of wild raptors. It's a great place to check out. People don't know raptors and they post a picture, and everybody kind of chimes in to figure it out. So we're going to have, or they're going to have a discussion on what they do on that group, how the group has evolved, and share some insight on Raptor ID. So it should be pretty great. I also want to mention that we do have Humana calendars available now on our website. If you go to humana.org, and we're selling 2023 Humana calendars with some great raptor photos and different raptor quotes and information. So somebody's asking, did you send the information of how to join again? Thank you,
Yeah,
Josh.
I thought it'd be nice to get it right at the bottom.
Yeah, thank you for that. So with that, thank you everybody for tuning in today and supporting Humana. We really appreciate it.